Hey there, today's video comes from you guys, the YouTube community, because you chose this in the latest poll I did. This video is called 50 Greatest Historical Events That Never Happened. And this is from our friend Simon Whistler over at Sideprojects. All right, but I want to see if I've been duped into thinking that some events happened. All right, if you'd like to partake in the polls that I've been doing more recently, make sure you're subbed to the channel. And over on the community page, you will see them. And as always, if you're a channel member here, you saw this video first. All right, let's get started. All right, long video, so grab a drink, grab a snack, and let's chillax and check out some history.
There have been thousands of years of recorded history full of incredible stories.
Fake
However,
history,
many of
right?
the most entertaining anecdotes may never have happened at all. Often, these stories first began circulating as fact well after the people involved
What's up,
were
Simon?
dead, meant as a way to emphasize a particular character trait of that individual. Others used entirely fictional people to illustrate.
Okay, so I know people, like YouTubers, will change their backgrounds sometimes when they're doing videos. I have not in years since I moved into my current place. But it seems weird to film yourself in front of just like your closet pantry over there where you can see just a bunch of random stuff.
Way to emphasize a particular character trait of that individual. Others used entirely fictional people to illustrate a particular point that the speaker wanted to get across. Today we'll be diving into 50 apocryphal tales, looking at some of the most famous and memorable
50?
stories from throughout history that may or may not have actually transpired.
Okay. I'm gonna let you know what I think. I'll let you know if I believed it. Not afraid to admit it. We're always learning,
George
right?
Washington and the Cherry Tree. When George
Oh,
Washington
yeah.
was 6 years old, he was given a hatchet as a present
cannot
by his
tell a
father.
lie.
As he was still a young child, Washington went out to play with his new toy, chopping at various things. While running around, Washington came across a cherry tree and struck it multiple times with his hatchet. He did not fully cut down the tree, but he damaged it enough that it wound up dying as a result. After seeing that his favorite cherry tree had been killed, Washington's father angrily confronted him, demanding to know what had happened to the tree. Washington replied, "I cannot tell a lie, father. You know I cannot tell a lie. I cut it with my little hatchet."
So this is one of those things that I think every country has, which is every country wants to be founded by people that have almost like mythical qualities to them, right? Because they're seen as these incredible figures. They're almost blameless, right? Perfect creatures. And yeah, this has been a famous one. I'd heard this wasn't true. If you're from another country outside the United States, what are some of the tales like that, the larger than life tales that make your, founding fathers or just famous people from history, inflate them into figures that they're just not? What are some other stories? I'd love to hear that.
Rather than being punished, the young George Washington was praised for his honesty. It's a great story about the bravery and integrity of the first American
When they
president.
all
but it
starved
almost
'cause they couldn't have their-
certainly never happened. The story was invented by Mason Locke Weems, a
chair.
traveling
Okay.
bookseller and the author of the first biography written about Washington. The former president had died in 1799.
So this,
Weems
just as interesting about false things from history, I think, is how did they come to existence? Like, where did those things come from? So I'm interested to see this.
published his book the following year in 1800. It was an instant success, but the story wasn't even originally included. Weems didn't add the apocryphal tale until the 5th edition of the book in 1806, meaning it was almost
Look at this painting. That's child Washington. Look at this. He's already full-grown man, just miniature. He's wearing the wig.
certainly just a piece of fiction. Today's episode is brought to you by the Paper-like 2.1 screen potential, which absolutely allows you to unlock your iPad's full potential. If you've been using an iPad, it's too shiny, it doesn't really feel like paper. Well, Paper-like makes it feel like paper. And surely the paper, I put it in, and on there ever since, you could just, the heart it's so normally super nice. Once, even with taking note, dive into the world. Praises, including me. I mean, I get paid too, but I wouldn't have done this if I didn't think it was amazing. It's a fantastic product. Anyway, thanks to Paperlike for today's sponsorship, and now back to today's video. George Washington and the silver dollar. Paperlike for today. I didn't think it was amazing. It's a fantastic product. Anyway, thanks to Paperlike for today's sponsorship, and now back to today's video. George Washington and the silver dollar. Next, let's have a look at another story about Washington.
Which one's
that
this?
may have more of a basis in reality. He was an active and athletic man, and it's often reported that he took part in the common pastime of distance throwing. This has led to superhuman
not know
descriptions
that.
of his strength, including a feat in which Washington
He could
threw
throw
a
a
silver
silver
dollar clear across the Potomac River,
okay.
or possibly the Delaware River. These stories are
Maybe he could
impossible
skip it.
exaggerations, as the silver dollar $1 didn't exist until Washington was in his 60s, and the Potomac is over a mile wide. However, the original story came from his step-grandson, George Washington Parke Custis. According to the grandson, it was a piece of slate roughly the size of a silver dollar that Washington had thrown, and that it was a narrow part of the Rappahannock River near Washington's childhood home. With some parts of the river narrowing to about 250 feet, this was much more plausible, though still very impressive. In 1936, the legend was put to the test by Baseball Hall of Famer Walter Big Train Johnson to celebrate Washington's 204th birthday.
Famous pitcher. The greatest pitchers ever.
Were estimated to be 380 feet across and given 3 attempts. The first fell just short of the opposite bank, and the second barely crossed the river. Not wanting to disappoint, Johnson threw the third coin clear over the heads of some 2,000 spectators on the opposite side of the river. The historic memento was then retrieved by Peter Yon. When questioned by...
That's it. Confirmed. Our founding father, he chucked something over the Potomac. I was thinking maybe he just skipped it. You know what I mean? But they did say it was definitely not, though, a silver dollar because it wasn't invented yet. We call that an anachronism, something that exists in history but is out of place in that timeline.
By reporters what he intended to do with the coin, Yon replied, "I cannot tell a lie. I'm going to sell it to the highest bidder." Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Nero is known for being a cruel emperor.
I knew this wasn't confirmed.
There is the oft-cited anecdote that he fiddled while Rome burned. It is true that Nero cared more about his own musical and artistic endeavors than he did about the welfare of the Roman people. Though if there was any truth to this story, Nero would have been playing the lyre rather than the fiddle. The story is often attributed to Roman historian Tacitus, though he never actually made this claim. According to Tacitus and many other sources, Nero was 35 miles away when the Great Fire of Rome broke out, and he quickly returned to help coordinate the relief efforts.
He has an alibi.
Tacitus did insinuate that Nero may have orchestrated the fire and that he used it for his own benefit by building his grand palace in the area that the fire had devastated. It's unclear what the origin of this apocryphal tale was, but the intent was clear: to portray Nero as a heartless and indifferent leader, more interested in himself than in the subjects he was supposed to be ruling over.
So the thing about Nero, though, is he was like a crazy guy. He was crazy. Basically, like, killed his mother, had his mother killed, and she was this overbearing mom that kind of pushed other things aside to make him emperor. And then he said he was basically haunted by her ghost the rest of his life, and he would pace around the palace at night, and he was a pretty crazy dude. And then what helped keep that story alive too is, like they were saying, what happened. So that was like right in some prime real estate in downtown Rome, where, you know, some of the there was public stuff, and there's also like some of the other rich people, and he didn't feel very bad about those people, you know, the people losing their possessions, because he went and built a massive palace to himself there, and eventually that's going to get taken down. And was it on that spot that they end up building the Colosseum as well, I want to say? Let me know if I'm right on that one.
Certainly not an unfair characterization of the Roman emperor, even if this story didn't happen. Zeno's paradoxes of motion. The Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea is famous for his motion paradox.
Stoicism.
The argument states that which is in locomotion must arrive at the halfway stage before it arrives at its goal. That certainly makes sense and seems to be obviously true.
Okay.
Zeno used this paradox to argue that all motion was impossible. Let's say you want to run a mile. Before you can finish the mile, you must run half a mile. But before you can finish the second half mile, you must run a quarter of a mile, then an eighth, a 16th, and so on. The remaining distance can be divided in half an infinite number of times, so the runner must complete an infinite number of tasks before arriving at the destination. Because a person cannot complete infinite tasks in a finite amount of time, Zeno argued that it was impossible to ever reach a destination. Using the same arguments on the front end of the journey, he also argued that it was impossible for a person to start moving as well, and thus all motion was an illusion.
I feel like this is one of those things that's like a useless paradox. Like, there are a lot of paradoxes that really can stump you because just logically it doesn't follow. But like that's like a pointless paradox. That's just like speaking a paradox into existence. So Zeno I know of as when we talk about Hellenistic period, a kind of founder, I guess you would say, in a lot of way, of Stoicism, branch of philosophy. But yeah, I guess he He out-stoiced himself there.
his writings, the Greek philosopher Simplicus wrote that upon hearing Zeno's argument, the aptly named Diogenes the Cynic stood up and walked around disproving the idea
got his
that
book
motion
over
was
here.
impossible. Of
Or a
course,
book about
this
him over
story
here.
almost certainly never happened. Zeno was only about 11 years old when Diogenes died, and Simplicius was
he
writing
was
about it
influenced
several
by him.
centuries later. But true or not, it was a fantastic mic drop moment for Diogenes. Behold a man. Diogenes is...
Okay, they are going to get to Diogenes. Okay. Yeah, he's one of my favorite kind of philosophers, the Stoic. I'll let him get in there. I covered a video before if you want to learn at least one, maybe a couple now. I think one of them was a Salmonella video, right? It was Diogenes. Interesting dude. And we'll see what Simon adds about him, but you're going to want to probably look at him more.
alleged antics didn't end with a drop moment for Diogenes. Behold a man. Diogenes' alleged antics didn't end with Zeno. This
Featherless
entire
bird.
episode could probably be filled with apocryphal stories of Greece's most hilariously antagonistic philosopher, but we'll stick with just one.
Stories about him are so funny.
What it means to be human was of great interest to the ancient Greeks, and interest in that question never really went away. This was not only the subject of many philosophical debates, but of scientific debates as well. Plato sought to create a scientific definition of what a man was, and settled on declaring that humans were defined as featherless bipeds.
Yeah.
It's not a terrible definition.
So
It's
again,
only
featherless biped. So biped is somebody that walks on two legs and you don't have feathers. Now, there's a lot of things that are bipeds that don't have feathers. So Plato, I don't know, he was kind of off on that.
humans and birds are bipedal, so this combination was rather uniquely human. Upon hearing this
Diogenes called him out.
Diogenes went home and plucked all the feathers off of a chicken.
Yeah.
He attended Plato's next lecture, and when Plato repeated his definition, Diogenes held up the bald chicken, declaring, "Behold, a man." Plato amended his definition to include with broad, flat nails.
See what he's saying there? So he brought a featherless chicken, said, look, a man, like, look, a human, according to your definition, it's a featherless biped. So he was just like talking crap, out in public.
Missing the
On Plato.
entire point of Diogenes' criticism. As popular as this story is, it doesn't appear in any ancient Greek texts. Or we can just hope that Diogenes was really as entertaining as all the apocryphal stories make him out to be. Detachable
Well, we can say a lot of that about a lot of things about by Diogenes because he didn't write anything. He didn't. Just like what we know of Socrates came from Plato. Socrates never wrote anything, and Diogenes similarly was a guy that wanted to talk. He wasn't like an academic that way, like Plato. Plato set up like schools and stuff like that, but yeah. So many of the things that he was said to be like, said he lived in basically like a turned big like oil barrel. And his only possession for much of his life, because his whole thing was like, get rid of all your possessions, was he had like a ladle to drink out of. And then he realized he didn't even need that because he could just use his hands. So he just got rid of all of his possessions and tried to live this like aesthetic life. While though he lived as a beggar, he still survived on the charity of others because he lived in Athens and people just gave him scraps and stuff like that. The dude was weird, but the things that are collected, if you get a book or something about him, is his quotes is a lot of, again, very cynical stuff because that was his branch of philosophy, was cynicism, but very witty and insightful. Look into Diogenes if you have any inkling for interest in philosophy, if you have not yet. All right, detachable shirt collars.
collars. In the late 1700s, high collars for men were all the rage.
Those are so
the higher
stupid.
and stiffer the collar a man had, the more wealthy
hate that whole
and
era
important
of
he must
fashion.
be. While many people today would consider this somewhat ridiculous trend to be a fashion
Basically
crime,
from like that time, so like 1500s through like the Victorian era, I feel it's all ugly crap.
it wasn't actually a victimless crime. Those collars needed to be washed and starched each time they were worn, and this task became one of the many jobs of irritated wives. One man's wife allegedly became so
no
annoyed
idea
with
what
the
the
whole
story is.
situation that she decided to do something about it. After a week of work, the husband would have 5 shirts that were perfectly clean except for the collars, and she would have to spend time washing and starching them all. Fed up with washing clean shirts, she cut the collars off of her husband's shirts, washing and starching them separately as a way to save time. This is the claimed origin of detachable shirt collars. collars, which became an entire industry starting in the 1820s. No name is ever given for this. I
don't care at all about
the
this.
entire story was likely invented as a marketing tactic to get women to encourage their husbands to buy these collars. Judgment of Solomon.
Don't care at all.
Judgment of Solomon is one of
All
most
the cutting the
famous
baby in half?
constantly being referenced and parodied throughout pop culture. In the story, two women who lived in the same house went before Solomon along with an infant child. Both women had given birth at around the same time, but one of the children had died in its sleep. They each claimed that the surviving baby was theirs and asked Solomon to rule on the matter. Solomon called for his sword and declared that the child would be cut in half, with each woman receiving half a baby. One woman agreed to this judgment, saying that if she couldn't have the baby, then no one could have it. The other begged Solomon to spare the child's life and just give it to the other mother. Solomon declared that the latter woman was the true mother, as a mother would do anything to save the life of her child, even if it meant giving it up. The story first appeared in the Book of Kings.
So I'm interested to see now what he's saying, because it's, you know, it's like in the Bible and stuff, and you can say what you will about historicity of some things like that. But why think, is there counter evidence, right? Or is it just a thing that's hard to confirm? Because so many of these things that you could do here, they could all be put in that same categories. How do you confirm any of this stuff?
As we previously discussed on this channel, much of that particular book of the Bible is a reasonably accurate chronicle of Jewish history. However, while there is a small amount of archaeological evidence suggesting King Solomon did exist, the biblical stories of his reign are regarded as being far more embellished than most of the Book of Kings. This story likely never happened and was just a popular anecdote to demonstrate Solomon's wisdom. Albert Einstein...
I mean, yeah, I would say so, because you got to think about it too. Like, okay, if those women had said that, did one woman really say, like, okay, I'll take half of a dead baby? Like, that sounds wild. But like the message of it about how the one woman would rather lose the child and preserve the safety of the child than not have it, like that is some like, it's some wisdom, you know what I mean? So I think these things, yeah, they do get attributed to characters when people are recording and building up their histories. We're talking about how, you know, every culture has their heroes, right? But it's interesting to see how these things develop. Were they actually coming from like tales that you know, like the telephone game, as they get passed over time, they become grander and less believable, you know what I mean? Or did one person just pull it out of thin air? You know what I mean? That's what's hard, and it can be interesting to kind of figure out if you can. We call that historiography. It's literally the study of the history of something, how the history of something has changed and been perceived differently over time. All right, Albert Einstein failed math. Oh, I have heard this debunked. Yep. It's because it was a different form of grading back then.
Maths. For generations,
or different
Einstein's early
numbering
career
system
has been a source of inspiration for those struggling in school as well as for the gifted but lazy underachievers. After all, everyone knows that Einstein failed maths as a child. Some versions of the story say it was because he had trouble understanding the material, and others say it was because
someone found his report card.
Just didn't care. But is there any truth to this famous story? No, not at all.
They found his report card.
Einstein, do you really think that he failed mathematics? It's unclear exactly where this myth originated, but it was ubiquitous well before he died. In 1935, a rabbi at Princeton showed Einstein a newspaper article making this claim. He reportedly laughed and said, "Before I was 15, I had mastered differential and integral calculus." The only kernel of truth of this story is that Einstein was a somewhat lazy student. He had very poor attendance during college, instead choosing to copy notes off one of his friends in the physics program. But despite this, he was
That's a real thing. I could tell you as a teacher of smart people, there's plenty of smart people that are lazy, and it could be for a number of reasons. You can just have a brain that functions at a high level, but yeah, be lazy. But there's also this idea of like people being bored, right? They learn something so quick that they tune out eventually, and usually tune out before other people do. And other people will sit there and be working, and he's like, I already understand this, right? And as you know, as teachers and stuff, we try to find ways to like challenge students like that, and that can be difficult because we pay obviously a lot more attention to the students that struggle than the ones that we need to push to higher levels that are succeeding. And I think that's important too. So, but yeah, I also had heard, because you saw back here, let me see if I can find it. His report card. Okay, so like this thing. And from what I understand, and I'd heard this too, if you go down,
Smith originated, but it was ubiquitous well before he died.
That those marks, like what did it say, like 6 or something, 6, whatever. like those are actually really good marks. And I don't know if it tops out at 6. I forget what it is, but those scores were actually like very good. And people were thinking that like those numbers were bad. That makes sense. So I think there was multiple things I've heard of with that.
Any class was from one university professor who took a personal offense to how often he skipped class. In any class like this, he was still at the top of his class, choosing to copy notes off one of his friends in the physics program. But despite
like Peter
this,
Parker
he
in
was
the
still
Spider-Man
at
movie.
the top of his class. The only poor grade
Brilliant,
Einstein
but
seems
lazy.
to have received in any class was from one university professor who took a personal offense to how often he skipped class, despite him excelling on the exams. Et tu, brute.
That's where, yeah, like the idea for teachers, you have to get over that because you're like, okay, if this person is doing really well, am I not doing a good job teaching? Like it might make a teacher feel like totally insignificant, that like I'm not even needed, and you're putting in all this work, but you have students that just ace it. You know, some teachers are going to respond with that, being like, oh, I need to make this more challenging or something like that. Or you can just embrace it and be like, hey, the kids know what they need to know, so let's prioritize other things.
March the 15th, 44 BC, Julius
All right, what's this?
on the exams. Et tu, brute.
Oh,
On March
yeah.
15th, 44
That's Shakespeare.
BC, Julius Caesar was surrounded and assassinated by around 40 Roman senators. After taking stock of his various attacks.
By the way, I hope you're keeping track. I want to see a bunch of you comment down below. Which of the things were things that you understood to be true, and maybe now you're finding out. So you're hearing me as it goes on, but I'd love to hear from you all down in the comments.
Final words to one who was very
And you, Brutus?
Et tu, brute. The story of Julius Caesar is inseparable
Betrayed
from
me.
these famous last words, but Caesar never said this. The
I heard
quote
it was
first
from
appeared
Shakespeare.
in William Shakespeare's play about Caesar. That's not to say that it isn't somewhat based in reality, but there is debate among historians about Caesar's last words. When the attack began, Caesar said in
what's
Latin,
Shakespeare's
"Ista quid
citation?
vis est," or "but this is violence." There are two common theories, both of which date back to at least
plausible.
the 2nd century AD. Some accounts claim those were his last words, and that he said nothing further once the stabbing began. Others claimed that he then spoke the words, "You too, child," somewhat similar to the famous "Et tu, brute." However, if Caesar really did say those words, it's reported that he said them in Greek rather than in Latin. If he did say that, it's also unclear whether the comment was even directed at Marcus Brutus, or if it was meant to be
look at that
Decimus
forehead.
Junius Brutus Albinus, who he referred to as being like
There's a lot of
son to him,
Brutuses.
and many believed was in fact his illegitimate child. Benjamin Franklin.
Here's the question I was more interested in, because there's like the story of them knowing like how many times he was stabbed. It was 20 whatever. That was one where I bring up in class, I'm like, was somebody counting? Like, where did that come from? Like, somebody went after and counted like all the holes. I don't know if there was an autopsy or something like that, but like, yep, we can confirm it was this many. Put it down in the historical record. All right, Benjamin Franklin's kite. Okay, so it gets electrocuted and he invents electricity. Right?
Franklin's kite. In June 1752, Benjamin Franklin tied a key to a string and
I thought maybe this was loosely
the key
true.
was struck by lightning, and thus Franklin discovered electricity.
Maybe.
That's how the story was originally told, though more recently it's become common knowledge that people already understood the existence of electricity, and that Franklin was
thought maybe
really
he did an
trying to
experiment.
prove lightning was made up of electricity. Although the story
Yeah,
is
though
considered
I don't know if you guys remember this too, but was there a thing when you were taught as a kid? Did anyone have the impression that, like he was saying, that like that by Franklin doing this, he was like the first to like understand electricity, to understand it and like how conducting and all that stuff works? Another thing where it's just like making these ridiculous stories to amp up founding fathers and stuff. And I'd always been like, okay, that's obviously really stupid, to think that it's like he invented electricity or, something stupid. But I thought, okay, well, like, did he maybe do experiments? Because he was like a scientist. He did that kind of stuff. Maybe he did experiments like that. Maybe he tied up a kite somewhere and wasn't necessarily like holding it, but, was trying to see if he could get struck and just perform an experiment.
apocryphal, with many historians doubting its authenticity. The origin of this story is a letter written by Franklin himself. However, in the letter, Franklin merely described the experiment. He never stated when or even if he had actually conducted it. 15 years later, Joseph Priestley's book History and Present Stages of Electricity recounted the tale, presumably with additional details provided to him by Franklin. While Priestley claims that Franklin and his son did conduct the experiment, there was no claim that the key was struck by lightning. If it had been, Franklin almost certainly would have died. We know this because others died while conducting lightning rod experiments described by Franklin.
I mean, you can survive lightning strikes.
The kite
a lot of people
drawn back
do.
down to the ground after flying in the storm, and Franklin felt an electrical charge.
Look at this. This is such a romanticized thing. I don't know who painted this, but look, there's like these like angels over there behind him, and he's being like inspired by I don't know, God or something. The founding father myths like this are so dumb. It's like they're dudes. They're regular dudes, all right?
The key when he touched it. It had picked up
Their achievements on their own are enough to talk about. You don't have to like add all this crap, you know?
Yeah. Benjamin Franklin's national bird.
By the way, I'm right now watching the Ben Franklin series on Apple TV. Anyone else watching that? I'm kind of into it, kind of not. Like, you know, I don't know. I'm like all over the place. I'm liking it or not. Anyways, let me know if you're watching that too. I'm giving it a great chance, but
it's tradition to eat turkey on Thanksgiving in the United States.
Yeah, I heard
according
this.
to a popular story,
Turkey.
this wouldn't be the case if Benjamin Franklin had his way. This story started to circulate in newspapers when the United States was celebrating its 100th birthday, and it was based on a letter that Franklin wrote to his daughter. In the letter, Franklin criticized the bald eagle, calling it lazy and of bad moral
bald eagle's
character. He went on to
awesome.
say
Look
that
at
the
that freaking look at that stupid thing. Okay, it's delicious, and we've domesticated them so much that they're just big walking, meals. They don't look anything like their original animal states. But look how awesome bald eagles are. Like, I think they made a good choice. It's a shame they're endangered and stuff, but it makes them such a cool, I don't know. Bald eagles are awesome.
Turkey was a much more respectable bird, and with all a true...
And the other thing too, we should not be eating, if we have the turkey as a national bird, we should not be eating our national animal. I think that is bad. That seems disrespectful.
Original native of America. But while Franklin may have preferred the turkey to the eagle, he never nominated it to be the national bird, nor did he make any of these comments publicly. The context of the letter
I don't know if I knew if it was attributed to him, though.
For the Great Seal of the United States, as he felt the design of the eagle made it look more like a turkey. This was what led to his tangents on avian morality. However, Franklin didn't want turkey on the Great Seal either. He had been given the chance to design the seal several years earlier, and his proposed design featured neither an eagle nor a turkey, but rather Moses parting the Red Sea. What that had to do with the United States is anybody's guess, which is probably why it was rejected. The Gordian knot.
No, I'd never heard of that.
Set out on his conquest of Asia.
Is this that knot that like nobody could undo? I forgot about that. So much of Alexander's life is total BS. Probably a lot of those mythical tales, and it's interesting because it's surprising a lot of the accounts of him and his life, how few actually really exist, and a lot of that having to do with how quick his coming into power is and how quickly it collapsed. He's become immortalized maybe more than any we know existed obviously and stuff, but maybe been immortalized more than any confirmed like character we know about him. Same with the whole story of his horse, and nobody could tame his horse, Bucephalus, and all that. He's got so many of these tales. I forgot about the knot. Anyway.
Minor. He had a legendary knot. When Alexander the Great set out on his conquest of Asia Minor, he had a legendary encounter with the Gordian knot. In Gordium, in Phrygia, there was an extremely intricate knot connecting an ox cart to a post. The knot had been
it's like a King Arthur kind of story,
a peasant who was declared king and became the foster father to the eventual King Midas. An oracle declared that any man who could untangle the elaborate knot would become ruler of all of Asia. When Alexander heard this story, naturally he wanted to untie the knot. According to the legend, he tried to untie the knot conventionally, but to no avail. He then reasoned that it didn't matter how the knot became undone, just that it did, so he pulled his sword out and cut the knot in half. Now, this is a fun story, demonstrating how seemingly complex problems can be easily solved with brute force, although that's not necessarily a great lesson, is it? But
that's where which ending would have been better, you think? Which would have been better for his whole aura? Was the fact that like if he actually undid this knot, or his wit or whatever of cutting it. Like, I don't know. I feel like it could be both ways. It was kind of lazy that he just cut it, but then it's also like ingenious. I don't know. What do you guys think? Which would have been a better ending to make him look better?
did it happen? Well, allegedly it sort of did. According to Greek historian Aristobulus, who accompanied Alexander on his campaign, they really did encounter the Gordian knot. However, Aristobulus described a more clever solution.
It likely existed?
Rather than cutting the knot in half, he stated that Alexander removed the linchpin from the yoke of the ox cart, freeing one end of the rope so that it could be easily untied. While this story is considered more plausible, it may still have been a piece of fiction
it's a little smarter.
designed by Aristobulus to legitimize Alexander's expansion of the Greek Empire. Columbus proved the earth was round.
Okay, yeah. All right. Well, anyway, yeah, Columbus proved the earth was round. Yeah. I hope no one believes this anymore. And that was a stupid thing too. Like, so many of these things I remember thinking as a kid, and like, where did those come from? When we were like in elementary school, were we just fed all this bull crap? Like, especially about anything related to American history. Yeah, like the earth was round and I cannot tell a lie. And like those things, like who was doing all that stuff? Was it just a piece of like intentional, I don't know, it's like indoctrination, but like of just trying to build up this idea of like American superiority or whatever. But yeah, even though Columbus has nothing to do with, the United States really, and he's not an American or founding father or anything.
Columbus dared to do the unthinkable and sail west to his inevitable doom. Everyone knew the earth was flat, but Columbus was a brave and daring explorer who sought to prove them all wrong. But before they could even leave port, Columbus had to convince the ignorant and superstitious sailors that the earth really was round. And of course, we all know this isn't true.
I remember hearing
well established since ancient
or at least
times that the
thinking
earth is
that.
round. However, the origin of
thinking
this
that or just hearing about
interesting. It's often attributed to the 1828 biography of Columbus by Washington Irving, titled A History of the Life and
This guy
Voyages
ruin
of
it?
Christopher Columbus. Irving was a fiction writer, and this supposed biography was a heavily fictionalized and unrealistic retelling of history. But while this book perpetuated the myth that people in the Middle Ages believed that the earth was flat, it was part of a much larger trend. This began in the 1600s as a coordinated effort by Protestants to disparage Catholic teaching. In the 1800s, the myth became extremely widespread, thanks to both revisionist histories, like
Protestants were flat earthers, is that what they're saying?
Increasing belief that science and religion had been extremely antagonistic in the Middle Ages. The latter belief completely ignored the fact that many scientists were also members of the clergy. Columbus's ships.
Okay, so yeah. Now he didn't say what the thing was that made Columbus different though. Was he believed that the Earth was much smaller than people thought. He thought you could get to Asia very quickly by going west, within just a couple weeks. I think he thought that it would take, and that is where he was wrong, and why everyone thought he was an idiot, because the estimate, or at least supposed size of the Earth, the circumference of the Earth, had bounced around and had been known since like ancient Greek times. So what people just thought was that ocean was so large, because they did not know about the Americas there, general European population, and thought that it was too far of a distance for anyone to be able to ever sail, right? So that was the big thing, and why he failed to get support for so long was his math was bad, and it was bad. He's very lucky the Americas existed. Otherwise, you would never have heard of him. He would have sailed off and never returned.
While we're on the topic of Columbus, children across the United States.
Okay, what was this one? Sorry.
Clergy. Columbus's ships. While we're on the topic of
Santa Maria?
Columbus, children across the United States have learned for centuries that he sailed to America on the Nina, the Pinta,
That's what I
and the
thought.
Santa Maria. However, those were not actually the names of the three ships.
What?
Ships at the time were almost invariably named after saints. So while the
Okay, I
Santa
did not
Maria
know
is
this.
correct, the other two names were not. Sailors would normally give nicknames to boats, which is what the names Nina and Pinta would have been.
Nina?
Pinta was Spanish for painted one, and Nina was Spanish for little girl. We know
Santa
that
Maria?
Nina's real name was the Santa Clara, but the actual name of the Pinta is unknown. Catherine the Great's death.
Okay, so I didn't know. Okay, I know. I thought that was legit. It's because it's like, why lie about that? Because so many of these things to think about does it change the story at all? That really doesn't change the story at all. All right, Catherine the Great's death. Is this going to be the horse thing?
Catherine the Great was Russia's longest reigning empress and accomplished a great deal during her time on the throne. However, one of the things she was most known
Westernization
for was
of
the
Russia.
many lovers she took as empress. Catherine would invite a man to be with her until she got bored of him, at which point she would give him some land, serfs, and a pension and send him on his way.
She didn't respect her husband. Actually, that was an arranged marriage. She's Prussian. She's German, essentially, and was married into that family and didn't even care about the guy. In fact, basically convinced him to step down as czar and she became the Tsarina as this like Prussian princess. So it makes sense she's going to have a lot of, other lovers. She didn't even like her husband. But let's remember, it's like that's different for a monarch. The men did that. It's like she was no different than any other, monarch. Plus, it was very common for a lot of the queens and royalty of nations to have their own, concubines. Very, very common. Okay, it was just that there's a double standard. There was a big double standard about men doing that versus women doing that. But yeah, they can do the horse thing.
This led to a lot of rumors and urban legends, the most famous of which was about Catherine's cause of death. According to the tale, Catherine was engaging in amorous activities with her favorite horse. The harness that was suspending the horse broke, and the horse crushed Catherine to death. Although this apocryphal tale began circulating immediately after her death and persisted for centuries, it was nothing but slander. Catherine actually died from a stroke, and the story about her horse was one of many salacious rumors started by her political enemies to discredit the empress.
Yeah, she had a bunch of enemies. I mean, peasants didn't like her too. She was fairly oppressive, actually, with modernizing Russia. And she did amazing things to modernize Russia and bring Russia into more westernization, a legacy that had preceded her from Peter the Great, and she kind of followed along with that. I mean, she was from basically Western Europe and wanted to do that. Basically, like, Peter before her, pretty much was dragging Russia into Western modernity. So anyway, but yeah, I never would have thought, the scootily pooping with a horse, as John Green would probably say. All right, the salting of Carthage. Oh, the salting of the land. This is one of those things that you would assume, like, okay, salting all of Carthage. The Carthaginian kingdom was large. It was one of those things where I would think, okay, maybe they did salt some things, some farmland or some important places, but like the whole Carthaginian Empire, that would be ridiculous. But let's see what Simon's got.
The Third Punic Wars took place between Rome and Carthage from 149 BC through 146 BC. Although the siege of Carthage took 3 full years, the Romans were eventually successful.
That thing looked like a fist.
Enough to win. They had to send a message. To that end, the Roman general Scipio Alamanus razed all the buildings in the city and sowed the ground with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again. Or so.
By the way, y'all looking out for next Oversimplified, right? Shouldn't we get Scipio coming in there? We'll get a third one. Oh man, if they shouted me out in that third video too, I'd lose my mind again. That was so cool of Oversimplified to shout me out in there.
He goes, and
Part
it's a pretty believable one.
Yeah,
there are many ancient references to salting the earth, and the salting of Carthage is among the most famous, second only to the biblical account of the salting of Shechem. However, while ancient sources do mention this practice, it is unclear how often it actually happens. When it did, it was likely a small symbolic gesture, possibly meant to place a curse on the conquered land. Actually salting the ground to prevent agriculture, which would have required massive amounts of salt, would have been prohibitively expensive.
You could probably recover from it, right?
However, it's unlikely that this happened to Carthage even in a symbolic fashion. While Scipio did raise Carthage and the Romans were intent on the city remaining in ruins, there are no ancient references to the salting of Carthage. The first book about the Third Punic War to include this detail wasn't written until the 19th century. Because the practice was believed to be common in ancient times, it's believed that the author added the detail simply to make the story more interesting in a plausible way. Historians of the past, everybody. Stockbrokers jumping out of windows.
Like adding stuff in movies, stockbrokers jumping out of windows. Yeah, this one of those things. I mean, I don't know if it was confirmed, but we know there were suicides. We do know there were suicides with the stock market crash.
The 1920s was a great time to be in the stock market.
Roaring
The market was experiencing a speculative bubble, inflating stock prices to completely unreasonable heights. However, as investors were reminded in the years 2000, 2008, 2015, and 2018, to name just a few, these speculative bubbles always burst. In October of 1929,
Are we ready for the next one?
Began. Between Black Monday and Black Tuesday, the market dropped over 23%. This was not an isolated incident, and the market had already been in sharp decline, but it remains the largest 2-day drop in history. People were panicked, and stockbrokers began jumping out of windows to end their own lives as they crashed headfirst into Wall Street, just like their stocks had.
Like not a single one.
There were lines of brokers waiting for a free window. This was the initial reporting in newspapers, and comedians quickly jumped onto the story to help perpetuate the rumors. However, there is not a single verified instance of this actually happening. While the Great Depression did see higher suicide rates than the 1920s had, there was no sudden spike in October of 1929. Most people accepted that the world had gone to chose to do their best to survive. The stockbrokers never jumped out of the window. Let them eat cake.
Shoot. So there's this show. I don't know if you guys have seen the World Wars on it was a History Channel. It was a 3-part series. World War I, interwar years, and then the World War II. And the opening scene of the second episode was a guy jumping off. I'm gonna have to, because I still like to show that little mini series in my class. I'm gonna have to abridge that a little bit and tell them, it probably didn't happen. All right, let them eat cake. Yeah, we all know this one, right?
Marie Antoinette was the last queen of France before the French Revolution.
We don't
and the
know
revolution
if she said it.
did not end well for her or her husband, King Louis XVI. They were both beheaded after an angry populace removed them from power. Of all the stories of Marie Antoinette, none is more famous than when she was informed that the peasants had no bread to eat. She was reported as saying, "Let them eat cake." However, there's no evidence that she actually ever said this, nor is it even a proper translation of the quote people have attributed.
I forgot where that came from. I used to know, I
is
think.
largely the same. In French philosopher Jean-Jacques
Rousseau
Rousseau's
did it?
autobiography, he made reference to an unnamed princess who, upon hearing that the peasants had no bread, replied, "Qu'ils mangeaient de la brioche." This translates to, "Let them eat brioche," which is a fancier, sweeter bread, but still, it's a bread, it's not cake. However,
supposed to be
while not published
insensitive.
until 1782, Rousseau is said to have completed the book in 1767, 3 years before Marie Antoinette even arrived in France. In reality, stories like this had existed for centuries in different languages all across the world. It was just a joke meant to show how out of touch the ruling class were with the people over who they were supposed to be ruling.
I feel like the revolutionaries after the revolution could have written anything they want about those monarchs, because again, they were so hated by the people that conducted the revolution that they were going to control the narrative after. You could see why something like that would perpetuate, because they lose and they were hated, and you can now rewrite the whole history there. So, all right, for Luther, is it going to be the actual hammering of the theses to the door at Wittenberg?
Martin Luther's 95 Theses.
I think that's under
On October the
question.
31st, 1517, Martin Luther walked to the doors of All Saints Church in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the church. It was a bold act of defiance that kicked off the Reformation and Luther's split from the Catholic Church. At least, that was what we've been led to believe. But it didn't quite go down like that. It is believed that Luther never nailed his theses to the church doors. He simply mailed them to the archbishop. Luther was a priest and a
got
devout
published.
Catholic, and he wasn't looking to form his own religion just to fix the church.
Correct.
His main issue was with the practice of indulgences. The church's way of raising...
That's Tetzel. Johann Tetzel, famous one on the left. What set him off was he was a famous indulgences priest, basically doing a tour of Europe. At this time, the church was trying to raise money to basically fund rebuilding of St. Peter's and Sistine Chapel, like all this other stuff, basically the Renaissance, right? Guys like Michelangelo feeding off of this type of money. And he went to Wittenberg and made his whole spiel to try to get people to donate. So indulgences is where you pay money to lessen the amount of time that your soul is supposed to spend in purgatory after you die. And this time, the indulgences were also being sold with the idea that you could also buy indulgences for ancestors of yours that have already passed, already dead, but are in purgatory like right now. And he would do these like Tetzel and these guys would do these like guilt trips. Like, can't you hear mom and dad yelling at you from help from purgatory? And people would drop money, and indulgences were not cheap for like a peasant or someone like this. It could be up to like half of your year's wages to do that, and that pissed off Luther, who thought there was no big biblical standing or no biblical justification for this practice, and thought it was just a corrupt method to increase the wealth of the church.
Money by telling people they could buy with the practice of indulgences. The church's way of raising money by telling people they could buy their way into heaven. His complaints were ignored and things spiraled out of control, resulting in Luther's excommunication. Historians agree that the theses were never nailed to the church door, particularly because Luther was a bit of a braggart, but he never claimed to have done this, only saying that he mailed them to the archbishop. However, even if it had happened, it wouldn't have been the grandiose display that it was made out to be.
It was common.
Church doors were essentially the city bulletin board, and people nailed documents to them all the time so that they would be seen by most people. Lady Godiva.
That's where it's like, it's not even like who cares whether it was put up on the door or not. because it didn't matter. It wouldn't have changed the effect. And especially because a lot of people did post stuff. That's where the church was the center of the social life of the town, right? So you have something to put up, news, you put it on the church door, right? And it's not like that would have caused as much of a stir as actually it getting printed up and then goes to other, other people, and it spread like wildfire throughout Germany. But all right, Lady Godiva's ride. Okay.
Right.
This one I may not
Lady
know.
Godiva was the wife of Leofric, Earl of Mercia in the 11th century. She felt pity for the peasants and the oppressive taxes.
I don't think I know about this story.
So she continually pleaded with him to lower their tax burden. Finally, sick of hearing her ask, Leofric told her that he would lower taxes if she rode through the streets naked on a horse. To his surprise, she agreed. Out of respect for Lady Godiva and what she was doing for them, all of the people of the city remained indoors during her ride except for one. That man, a tailor named Tom, gave us the expression
Peeping Tom. That's where that came from.
So iconic that it inspired multiple paintings and sculptures by famous artists, but there's actually no evidence that it ever happens. This story wasn't first recorded until over 2 centuries after her death.
I have no idea about this story, actually, I'll be
impossible
honest.
to have happened. Though Godiva and Leofric were real people, contemporary historians made no reference to Godiva other than her being married to an earl and her considerable donations to the church. If a famous naked ride took place, it seems like the sort of thing that they might have mentioned.
I mean, some people just get drunk and go out naked in public. You right? Eureka.
Archimedes was a Greek mathematician and scientist who was well known during his time. He was summoned by King Hero II of Syracuse to inspect a crown that had been commissioned. Hero
Archimedes
had supplied the gold for the crown, but he wanted Archimedes to determine if the gold had been adulterated with cheaper metals like silver. The only caveat was that Archimedes could not damage the crown, which was likely in the shape of a wreath. Although this question would be easily answered if Archimedes knew the weight and volume of the crown, its highly irregular shape made calculating the volume a difficult problem. Archimedes went home to soak in the bath and think about the problem, and when he saw the water level in the bath rise as he sat down, he realized he could use the displacement of the water to measure the crown's volume. He jumped out of the bath and ran naked through the streets yelling Eureka, excited that he could answer the question. While this story does appear in ancient historical accounts such as the work of Vitruvius, the story is still somewhat apocryphal. Archimedes certainly could have solved such a problem for King Hero, but running naked through the streets was likely a playful embellishment added by the historians. From a logical standpoint, he is also more likely to have used Archimedes' principle of buoyancy rather than the displacement of water, as the latter would have required measurements that were impractically precise given the technology at the time.
How come I'm getting different ideas right now about that like displacement of water thing in the bathtub, attributing it to someone else other than Archimedes? Anyone else? Is there someone else that's been attributed to with that, and for getting some of those ideas again about displacement of water and all that? Maybe I'm tripping, but all right, Archimedes' death ray?
Archimedes' death ray. There are many apocryphal stories about Archimedes,
is this like
but the other most famous one involves the siege of Syracuse during the First Punic War. During the siege, it was said that
using light
used a series of large mirrors to focus the light from the sun onto oncoming Roman ships, setting them ablaze while they were still in the water. This has been referred to both as Archimedes' heat ray and his death ray.
That wouldn't even be possible.
That lines up with people's belief about the brilliant inventor. However, the earliest references to this death ray came 4 centuries after the war. Even then, it was only stated that Archimedes set fire to the boats, and the author didn't specify how. Still, the theory seemed somewhat plausible, and numerous attempts have been made to create this event using only materials that would have been available at the time. Despite the best efforts of Mythbusters and other teams trying to recreate Archimedes' invention, they have been universally unsuccessful.
Yeah, I would think that to make that kind of lensing effect, like to build something like that could take down like a ship, like wouldn't that have to be insanely enormous for that to exist? Like if you've done that with a magnifying glass, I mean, you have to get that thing is so magnified, and you have to have it and sit it at such an angle, and then it makes just like a tiny little kind of burn, but it's a cool idea.
Even though it's
like as a weapon,
possible that it could work, the logistics of aiming the mirrors perfectly at a moving target make it incredibly unlikely that this really happens. Archimedes was killed during the siege by the Romans, so if he did have some clever way to make his death ray work, then the plans.
They try to reenact that with that. They try to reenact that with that newest Indiana Jones movie. Anyways, the William Tell, the apple.
Everyone has heard the famous story of William Tell and the apple, but for the people of Switzerland, it's much more than that. The legend goes that after refusing to remove his hat, the tyrannical Habsburg bailiff Albrecht Gassler ordered Tell to shoot an apple off of his son's head at a distance of 120 paces. If he failed, they would both be put to death. Tell loaded his crossbow, counted out 120 paces, and then fired, taking the apple clear off of his son's head. When Gessler asked why there was a second arrow in his jacket, Tell said that if he killed his son, he would have killed Gessler next. This is the part most people know, but the story goes on from there, with Tell being imprisoned, escaping, assassinating Gessler, and helping lead the rebellion that led to the formation of the Old Swiss Confederacy. Naturally, Tell became a national hero.
Cool origin story. So I was saying about origin stories, about national folk heroes and stuff. Switzerland, they got a pretty cool one there.
Is this story a complete fabrication? There's no evidence that Tell actually even existed. The first account of this story was written hundreds of years after it happened, and the author got the date wrong by 16 years. If that wasn't damning enough, another story, written over 300 years before this allegedly took place, was written by King Harold Bluetooth of Denmark and a man named Palnatoke. It's nearly the exact same story, with Palnatoke and Bluetooth taking the roles of
Vikings.
Tell and Gessler. Death by ham sandwich.
It's like they're going to these historical events and it gets something modern with Mama Cass or whatever they call Mamas and Papas. Is that what right? Ham sandwich.
Also known as Mama Cass, was a beloved member of the 1960s group The Mamas and the Papas, as well as an accomplished solo artist. And the story goes
like such an abrupt change
on a ham sandwich. It's such a well-known tale that it was even joked about.
Didn't she choke?
Powers. However, while we know that this was not Cass's true cause of death, it wasn't a total fabrication. When Dr. Anthony Greenberg saw Cass's body in the room where she had died, his first instinct was that she died of asphyxiation. He noted that she'd been lying down while eating a ham sandwich and drinking a Coke, which he deemed a dangerous activity, especially for someone overweight. His initial analysis was that she had choked to death from the sandwich. The public immediately latched onto this story because it was deemed a humorous cause of death. Cass's weight had made her the constant butt.
She didn't choke to death?
And this fit the narrative that they had constructed around her perfectly. So much so that few people took notice when her actual cause of death was revealed after her autopsy. Though it was related to her weight, Cass did not die choking on a sandwich. She had been
rude. Who made that up?
Weight, but also routinely went on dangerous crash diets to lose weight for photo shoots and the like. The combination of these crash diets and being generally overweight put a tremendous amount of strain on her body, and she died of a heart attack. She just happened to coincidentally be eating a ham sandwich when that happened. The original vampire. Prince of Wallachia, Vlad Dracula, or
yes. Okay, so one thing to talk about him that he didn't drink the blood, but yeah, origin story probably is definitely influenced by Mr. the Impaler.
The Impaler is often referred to as the world's first vampire. While vampire legends predated Vlad, vampires obviously aren't real, whereas Vlad was, allowing him to earn this title. Vlad was a brutal and ruthless leader, known for impaling his enemies on spikes. He is often cited as drinking the blood of his enemies as well, with the somewhat toned-down version of the story being that he would walk among the impaled bodies while eating dinner, dipping his bread in their blood. Since Vlad was such a feared ruler and was famous for his cruelty and brutality,
wonder how much
it's
of that's
easy to
true,
see
though.
how this rumor would have spread. Even if it wasn't true, it would certainly be to his benefit if everyone believed it. Modern historians have always questioned how realistic this story was, with it being dismissed as legend and hyperbole. However, new research may have provided a definitive and somewhat shocking answer. According to the study published in 2023, Vlad definitively did not drink any blood, human or animal. In fact, he was probably a vegetarian. Skin and saliva samples were taken from a letter written by Vlad, and expert analysis showed a complete lack of animal proteins. This would
you rather have a national heroic story or whatever, a national folklore like this that's actually more dark and twisted, right? If you are like Romanian or something, or would you rather have the more noble character and those myths like George Washington and the cherry tree and stuff? I don't know. It might be kind of cool. Like, yeah, one of our early founders, he drank blood.
only be possible if Vlad was a vegetarian or possibly even vegan. Of course, that surprising fact doesn't make him any less brutal. Oscar Wilde's last words. Oscar Wilde was impoverished in poor health for his last few years. The end of his life was spent confined to his bed in room 16 in the Hotel d'Alsace in Saint-Amand-de-Pré, Paris, before he finally died from meningitis. On his deathbed, it's said that Wilde spoke his final words to a friend, author, and journalist Claire de Prats. "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. one of us has got to go. It's a good line, and complaining about
think I've heard
aesthetics in
that.
his dreary hotel room while dying certainly seemed to fit Wilde's personality. Last words are notoriously difficult to verify. However, this story is most likely only a slight exaggeration. Pratts wrote that Wilde spoke these words to her, but not on his deathbed. Instead, she said that he made this remark weeks before his death during one of his final trips outside his hotel room. So while it is likely that Wilde said the famous quote attributed to him, the idea of them being his last words were a later embellishment to make the story more interesting. The Betsy Ross flag.
Okay.
The original first American
yeah.
flag featuring 13 stars.
I forgot about this. Fake news. I like that flag.
Stars and stripes is often referred to as the Betsy Ross flag in honor of its creator.
She had nothing to do
was
with
a
it,
Philadelphia seamstress who had sewn flags during the American Revolution and in the decades that followed, and she was personally commissioned by George Washington to create the design for the first official United States flag. This is an iconic story about the founding of
Another
the
thing I
United
feel like
States, and Betsy Ross
learned
sewing
in
the
elementary
original flag
school.
was even immortalized on a US stamp. However, virtually every part of this story is fiction. Betsy Ross really did spend 50 years sewing flags, mostly for the military, but there's no evidence she designed the so-called Betsy Ross flag. Even if she had, it was actually the second official flag rather than the first. The original story, as told by her family, was that Washington had a sketch of the design that he wanted, and that Ross's only design contribution was to switch from 6-pointed stars to 5-pointed stars, as they'd be easier to manufacture.
Five's better.
This evolved over time into her designing the entire flag. While her grandson may have believed the more humble family lore he presented of Ross only changing the shape of the stars, most people spreading this story knew that it was entirely fictional. But when her grandson came forward with the story, it was just after the Civil War leading up to the nation's centennial celebration. There was a strong desire to create wholesome American lore that could help unite the nation, so the story was publicized with no regard.
That answered my question about where this stuff comes from, and trying to romanticize so many parts of history. It's very deliberate.
Veracity. Burned at the stake.
Centennial.
The Salem Witch.
So that the one with the circular one that we call the Betsy Ross flag. What are the originations of that? Do you guys know? All right, what's this?
So, the story was publicized with no regard given to its veracity. Burned at the stake. The Salem witch trials are a well-known part of American history, and every Halloween, nearly 1 million tourists come.
I found out recently through my parents who did some genealogy work that I have ancestors from the Salem area, like the Salem witch trials, like there at that time and stuff too. I'm pretty sure I had ancestors who were burning witches. I carry their curse today.
Come to see the city where it all went down and make traffic miserable.
Yeah, it was not that big of a
It began
deal.
when two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began experiencing fits symptomatic of bewitchment. They named the witches, who they believed to be casting spells.
Didn't they
on
not
them,
even
and the witches
execute that
were
many?
burned at the stake. This set off a cascade of events in which dozens of innocent people were executed after being accused of witchcraft by young girls. While this is how most people remember it, it's not exactly what happened. To start, most of these events didn't actually take place in modern-day Salem. The trials were primarily held in Salem town, which is now Salem, but the people involved were all in Salem Village, which is present-day Danvers. More importantly,
Who cares?
nobody was burned at the stake. This mistake is likely the result of confusion more than anything else. Witch trials occurred throughout Europe as well, and in Europe it was customary for the witches to be burnt. In Salem, however, the standard method
Did a lot of that in Europe.
was hanging. Of course, this ultimately worked out better for the town of Salem. Burning the victims wouldn't have left any meaningful landmarks, but Gallows Hill is now a popular stop for tourists. War of the Worlds. On October the 30th,
I love the War of the World story. Which part of this is false? I'm trying to remember.
1938,
Maybe just the
CBS
scope of
Radio
it?
decided to air a very special Halloween broadcast. Live on air, Orson Welles and the Mercury Theatre were going to read a radio dramatization of H.G. Wells's famous novel War of the Worlds. The show was written.
This was such a brilliant idea, too.
So it opened with a disclaimer that what was being presented was a fictional radio play rather
that's
than a
right.
breaking news bulletin. However,
But people, most of the people that listen to it, you're not going to hear the beginning part where they're going to give you the notice. So I would have done like, hey, just so you know, if you're listening to this, it's not real, but don't tell people that end up learning about it. I would have done that to make it more fun.
everybody caught that announcement. The fake newscast was airing alongside the Chase and Sanborn Hour, a popular show that had only become more of a hit with the addition of ventriloquist Edgar Bergen and his dummy Charlie McCarthy. Because ventriloquism apparently translates amazingly well to radio.
That's
After the
what I
first
was
comedy
wondering.
sketch, there was a musical number, and many listeners changed stations to CBS, having missed the
Ventriloquism?
initial disclaimer.
Radio?
This resulted in widespread panic. Depending on how much of the show
That ruins the
before losing
gimmick.
their They believed either there was a major natural disaster, an invasion from the Germans, or an actual Martian invasion. That's how newspapers reported it anyway. But it was all a lie. Radio news had been rapidly gaining popularity, and it was stealing advertising revenue from print newspapers. In an ironic twist of fate, the newspapers decided to use the fictional news drama to paint radio news as untrustworthy by knowingly printing their own lies. Newton and the apple.
Wait, what? So I've had trouble following that. So it never happened? Okay, apple falling on Newton. Yeah, I mean,
Newton was enjoying a peaceful day in his garden at Woolsthorpe Manor in Lincolnshire, England. As he sat beneath an apple tree, an apple fell off the tree and landed directly on his head.
And then he
Sudden
invented
impact
gravity.
turned Newton's thoughts to that of gravitation, an attractive force that pulled things down toward the Earth. It's a well-known story, though even children assume that it's apocryphal when they hear it. The idea that Newton's laws were derived merely by being bonked on the head with an apple sounds too preposterous to be true. However, it's not actually that far off the real story. The story dates back to a biography of Newton that had been written by one of his friends, and the story about the apple was told to him directly by Newton. Though he never claimed that the apple hit him on the head, an apple was indeed the inspiration
It did fall,
for his
though.
work with gravity. Rather than being struck by the apple, Newton merely observed an apple fall within his line of sight. It got him wondering why an apple falling from a tree would always fall straight down towards the Earth rather than at an angle or even instead of falling upwards. The idea of an apple falling up obviously sounded ludicrous, but without Newton explaining how gravity worked, there was no real scientific explanation as to why. Battle of Thermopylae.
yeah, so, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And, you know, Newton, wasn't he like 13 when he invented calculus too? Something crazy like that. The dude was such a genius. All right, Thermopylae. Here's some stuff I know, you know, we'll see what they talk about. There weren't just 300 Spartans there. There are 300 Spartans or whatever around there, but there are also a lot of other Greeks there. So I wonder if that's what they're going to talk about.
Everyone knows the story of the Battle of Thermopylae. It was one of the most famous battles of ancient times and was immortalized in the comic book and subsequent movie 300. During the battle, 300 Spartans stood alone against a Persian army numbering
they were not
in the
alone.
hundreds of thousands. The Persians would have to travel through the
And a
bottleneck
Greek army with
pass
them.
of Thermopylae, effectively negating their numbers advantage. The battle
Of other
lasted for 3
city-states.
days until the Spartans were dead to the last man, but with 20,000 Persian deaths, Xerxes decided to withdraw his army rather than pressing onward to engage a larger Spartan army. It's an incredible story that demonstrates both the skill of Spartan soldiers and the importance of battle tactics, but while the basic idea of the story is true, it is a complete exaggeration. Herodotus recorded that
Herodotus screwed that up.
4,000 Greek deaths, something that would be impossible if there were only 300 men there at the start. A Greek army of roughly 7,000 men fought against the Persians for 2 full days. After the second day, Leonidas learned that the Persians had found an alternate path and were moving to flank them, so he dismissed much of the Greek army. Though only 300 Spartans remained for the final day of the battle, another 2,000 Greek soldiers stayed as well. The Greeks also didn't all fight to their deaths, as it was reported that most of the 400 Thebans eventually
Spartans
surrendered to the
might
Persian
have?
army. It was still impressive that the Greek army was able to hold the position successfully as long as they did, but the story has been exaggerated over time to depict the Spartans as effectively superhuman. Chaston.
So some other things too is the numbers. Yeah, the numbers, he kind of was hitting it, but Herodotus did terrible with numbers for those things. Now, what Herodotus did was much of what we know about the Persian Wars comes from him. And what he did do, which was great for, history purposes, was interviews, right? Interviewed people that were involved in the war and stuff like that. But there was a lot of bias, of course, coming from the Greeks. And one thing he really screwed up was numbers, where, like the Greek numbers would be very small, but then would just completely inflate the Persian numbers. At that, there it said that like Thermopylae, and with that invasion of the Persians, he said there was like a million Persians came there. It's like, no, a size of an army or anything like that was non-existent. But where I had heard kind of another way to look at this is back in college. I took a class on classical Greek history, and I remember the professor there says, if you want a better look at numbers and maybe something more realistic, divide everything, every number that he ever did with that by 10, and you probably have a much more accurate version. Like, okay, there probably weren't 2 million troops there, but like 200,000, I mean, that would have been a lot, but in all of the Persian army all around, maybe. you know, whatever.
Chastity belts. We can all imagine
At a very high
so
end.
vividly.
Hey, what's this one? Chastity belts? Oh, yeah.
Human. Chastity belts. We can all imagine the scene so vividly. It's the Middle Ages, and you start to get frisky with some comely lass. But as you lift up her frock, you suddenly find yourself face to face with a chastity belt, padlocked shut by either her father to prevent premarital sex or her husband to prevent infidelity while he's off at war. It looks like you're going to have to settle for another night of medieval hand stuff. It's an extremely common depiction that has existed for centuries, and it's entirely fictional. The idea that chastity
That does sound very theatrical,
seems to have taken hold in the 18th and 19th centuries. Not because there was any evidence that they existed, just because the idea of a chastity belt made their ancestors seem backwards and repressed, making them come off as much more enlightened by comparison. While some references to chastity belts exist from the Middle Ages, they are exceedingly rare. Any references that do exist are either metaphorical or satirical in nature, and there are no actual chastity belts from the time period that have ever been found.
There's not a museum.
The earliest known sketch of one of these devices is from a book written in 1405, which at first suggests that they may have existed. However, this book also has sketches of devices to make the wearer invisible and is filled with fart jokes. So it's hard to believe that this
Seems legit.
wasn't also
Seems legit to
Atlantis. The lost city of Atlantis was a utopian society.
Atlantis. Okay, so my whole thing with Atlantis, because you're going back to ancient Greek, and these were myths that came down through probably the Minoan civilization. They get down to the Greeks before the current Greek writing that we use today was invented. But from what I've looked at, I think that they might have been describing the Minoan civilization.
Located on an island,
probably at
beyond
Knossos,
Pillars of Hercules, whatever that means. They were
around
an advanced
Akrotiri,
naval
you know,
empire,
somewhere around
controlling nearly all western portions of the known world. Then, after a failed attempt to conquer Athens, the Atlanteans fell out of favor with the gods, and their island was cast into the sea. Most people understand that this was fiction, but some of the nuance has caused a lot of confusion. To start, there are still those that believe Atlantis was a real place and have dedicated their lives to finding it. And to those people, we wish them the best of luck in their endeavor. But as for those of us who are aware there was never an Atlantis, how important this piece of fiction was often gets misunderstood. Despite its fame and notoriety, the story of Atlantis was a relatively minor aspect of two books written by Plato. There was not some rich oral tradition about this lost city, nor was Atlantis a major part of the public consciousness at the time. It was simply an allegory that Plato invented to try and prove a point, though exactly what his point was.
Remember, a lot of what Plato did, though, was writing things that were orally told from before. Most things were, were oral that way. And the Greeks believed and had a lot of folklore in their culture that predated them. It goes back Mycenaean. It could go back to Minoan. And to hear, about civilizations collapsing and stuff like that in that region is not unheard of. Easily, again, could be the Minoan civilization. So the Minoans, they were contemporaries with the ancient Greeks, again, about 2000 BC or so. And the volcano Thera, which is in the Aegean, not that far from Crete, which is where they were capital out of, destroyed basically that civilization. It ruined farmland. It buried. It was a buried land and stuff like that. And that's where a lot of these things like myths, can have origins in reality. It's just that over time, those stories get bigger and more fabricated.
It remains a matter of considerable debate. Dr. Seuss's most famous quote.
Which
Dr.
one?
Seuss is known for a lot of things. He invented the word nerd, made World War II propaganda films, and taught generations of kids that it's okay to invite strangers into your house and violate all of your parents' rules as long as you clean up and don't get caught. While Dr. Seuss has written a lot of memorable books, the constant use of nonsense words invented to fit the rhyming scheme prevent them from being highly quotable. However, there is one quote for which Theodore Seuss Geisel is most famous. Be who you are and say what you feel, because those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind. It's a beautiful sentiment, and it certainly sounds like something Seuss would say, aside from the lack of rhymes, but he never actually did. Or at the very least, there's no record of it.
Where'd it come from?
Some of the earliest references to this quote are from the 1940s, and in both instances, it is the punchline in a joke about difficult seating arrangements at a party. Even earlier than that, in 1938, the quote appeared in a London-based engineering journal, again used as a punchline. In that instance, the line appeared in quotes despite not being attributed to anyone in particular, suggesting that it was just a common phrase or piece of wisdom at the time. The Bermuda Triangle. In the Atlantic Ocean, there exists a dangerous patch of sea known as the Bermuda Triangle. This vaguely defined area is the triangle roughly formed by Bermuda, Puerto Rico.
By the way, you understand how large of an area that is? Bermuda is way out there. Like Bermuda Triangle, when I was young, whatever, didn't know about it, was seemed to be very, very small, or a lot smaller. But it's like a huge chunk of the entire Atlantic Ocean. It's not very like much of a triangle either. I mean, okay, Puerto Rico, but you got like all these other islands and stuff, and then Florida like makes part of it. Is weird.
The Florida Keys. The area.
I mean, shipwrecks exist around islands.
Disappearances and sunken vessels, often under mysterious circumstances. A boat or plane that entered the triangle might never be seen or heard from again. There are many attempts to explain why this area of sea is so cursed, most of which are supernatural in nature. Some offer scientific explanations, such as localized magnetic fields screwing with compasses and navigation equipment.
Aliens.
But there is a much simpler explanation for the disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle, which is that it's a lie concocted by writers looking to make money with a sensational story. In reality, there is nothing mysterious going on. Many disappearances were total fabrications, and of those that really happened,
a lot of flights
ships that were considered
around
missing
there.
but arrived late to port were still included in the tally to inflate the numbers and make them look more noteworthy. Considering the Bermuda Triangle is an area of the Atlantic that received exceptionally heavy traffic from boats, planes, and tropical cyclones, there was nothing disproportionate or mysterious about the number of lost
It's just a
The
numbers
curse
thing.
of the billy goat. Sports are full of superstitions, but it's not every day
Oh,
that an
baseball,
actual
right?
curse is placed on a team. William Sionis was the owner of the Billy Goat Tavern in Chicago, and as an avid baseball fan, he had gone to Wrigley Field to watch the Chicago Cubs play in the 1945 World
curse.
Series. And either because he wanted to promote his business or just really loved animals, Sionis brought his pet Billy Goat with him to the game. Others in attendance found this goat Murphy to be disruptive, so
forgot about
Sionis and his
this.
pet were asked to leave. Enraged, Sionis placed a curse on the team, condemning them to never play in the World Series again. The Cubs lost the game and the series, and it really seemed like they'd never compete in the World
was like
Series
100
again.
years
This
before
is how the
they made
story
it
was
back.
always told, but it's unclear what, if anything, Sionis said when he was ejected from the stadium. The most common accounts are either that he said nothing, or that he angrily stated, "Them Cubs, they ain't gonna win no more." That doesn't sound like how someone would place a magical curse if curses were actually real, but you can't argue with the results. After losing that World Series in 1945, the Cubs wouldn't appear in another World Series until 2016, 72
Bartman.
years after the curse
No.
was placed, and 106 years since they'd last won. They
That was
did win
earlier.
that year, reportedly breaking the curse. Cleopatra.
The dude that caught that foul ball that Moises Alou was trying to catch in left field, Bartman, whatever, and he interferes with it, and then they didn't win, and they said I was like blaming it on that. I love baseball has the most like mythology, probably because it's like it's so old. You know, I mean, it goes back to like the Civil War, and I love that stuff. It's Americana that way. Reminds me like the Red Sox, they had that curse, the curse of the Bambino, and over that once they sold, back was it 1908 or whatever, they sold Babe Ruth, they were never going to win a World Series ever again, and it was like almost 100 years. All right, Cleopatra's Pearl Wine. I'm not sure exactly what this is going to be in reference to. Not her death, right? Because that was the asp.
Cleopatra's pearl wine.
snake.
Cleopatra and Mark Antony were having a lovely dinner banquet together. Suddenly, Cleopatra removed a priceless pearl from her earring and dropped it
course
in
they
a
look
glass of
Western
wine.
European
Once it
there.
dissolved, she drank the wine with a pearl inside.
Northern,
Some sources
actually.
say that Cleopatra did this to show her indifference to wealth, and others say that she did it to prove that she could consume the wealth of an entire nation in a single meal. Regardless of her motivation, the way the story is most commonly
All
told
supposed to
now
be the-
is that
the
Cleopatra
Roman era
dropped the pearl into her wine without provocation.
of the
However, the
Egyptians.
original story, as told by Pliny the Elder, is a little bit different. In the original version, Cleopatra and Antony had made a wager about who would serve the most expensive feast, and this was Cleopatra's way of winning. Pliny also said that the glass was vinegar rather than wine. In ancient times, this story was regarded as a real historical event, though it was later deemed apocryphal. However, that may not actually be the case. According to a 2010 paper published in the National Library of Medicine, the story is actually plausible. Their research concluded that the concentration of acetic acid found in vinegar made from wine was ideal for dissolving a pearl, making this story at the very least plausible. President Taft's unimaginable
I was okay, whatever about. I don't care about the wine thing, but this was depressing when I found out that Taft did not get stuck in a bathtub. I wanted that to be true.
girth.
He was a
President
big
William
boy.
Howard Taft was one of the United States' most accomplished presidents. Not only did he serve as president, he went on to teach at Yale
Supreme
before
Court.
being appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court and becoming Chief Justice. But despite all of this, there is only one thing that people really remember about Taft. He was a big dude. At 6 feet tall and 340 pounds, Taft was America's fattest president. As the story goes,
he's an
Taft was so
offensive
fat
lineman.
that he actually got stuck inside a bathtub in the White House. The rumor was popular even back when Taft was president, and its origins are impossible to nail down. What we can tell you, however, is that it is entirely untrue. Of course, that's not to say that a standard bathtub being unable to accommodate the president was
I want to
concern.
believe.
Instead, he had a custom bathtub installed, one that was large enough to seat 4 typical size men comfortably. When going to inspect the progress
Just what
on
you
the
did.
Panama Canal, Taft even had a special bathtub installed aboard the USS North Carolina for his trip. The tub was over 7 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. Origin of the
That reminds me, or is making me wonder if they're going to do the Teddy Roosevelt riding a moose. That was another thing I wanted to be true when I first heard about that. And it was actually like a doctored photo of him wading through a river while riding a moose. Some are just cool. I want these last two to
chip.
be
If you've
true.
ever worked a retail job, you've undoubtedly
Potato
had at least
chip.
one nightmare customer.
I don't know
For
this
George
story.
Crumb, a chef at Moon's Lake House in Saratoga Springs, New York, that customer walked through the door on August 24th, 1853. The customer ordered a plate of French fries, but he kept sending them back to the kitchen. Each time Crumb made the fries, the customer complained that they were either too thick, too soggy, or not salted enough. After finally getting annoyed with the customer, Crumb cut some potatoes as thin as he could, fried them until they were crispy, and doused them with salt. To his surprise, the customer loved them and Saratoga chips were born. That brand of chips still exists to this day, but is there any truth to the story? Well, we can't say for sure.
I've never heard of
It's
that.
certainly possible that Crumb made potato chips while trying to please a pain-in-the-ass customer, but the story may have been invented later as a marketing tool. Either way, it's somewhat irrelevant, as Crumb did not invent the potato chip, though he did help popularize them in the United States. A recipe for potato chips was published in an 1817 cookbook that was a bestseller in both the US and the UK. The recipe book didn't refer to them as potato chips, but there's no disputing that that's what the recipe would make. Signing of the Magna Carta.
Crisp.
June the 15th, 1250.
Crisps, as they would have called it in Simon's Land there. All right, signing the Magna Carta. What about it is not true exactly?
Is one of the most important dates in history. On that day, King John signed the Magna Carta, widely regarded as the most important document in the development of modern democracy. However, why he signed it is sometimes a matter of disagreement. There are the two most common stories, and then there's the truth. One of the popular versions
unique for
is
its
that John was
time
tricked into signing
in
the
Western
document.
Europe.
He is often viewed as being an incompetent and ineffective leader, with England losing a significant portion of lands that it had gained thanks to his father, King Henry II, and his brother, King Richard the Lionheart. John is also typically the villain in stories about Robin Hood,
Rip
in which
King
he was
Richard.
frequently bested and outsmarted. As such, the idea that he may have been tricked into signing the Magna Carta without
Who found
understanding it
Lionheart's
became one of the
bones?
main narratives. The other common belief is that John signed the Magna Carta out of the goodness of his heart, signing it out of a sense of
heck
justice for the
no.
people of England. Of course,
No.
this is completely at odds with what is known about King John's character. He was known for being spiteful, cruel, tyrannical, and arbitrary in his judgments. In
No
reality,
king has ever done that out of the goodness of their heart. Like, here, I'll just agree to limit the power of me and my ancestry. No, I mean, the nobles were going to freaking upend him. You know, it's like, it's not how it works. It's like somebody going on strike. You're going to have to make a, to save anything, you're going to have to make a compromise, you know.
John's feudal barons revolted against him because of his overall behavior. After being confronted with an army much larger than what he would have been able to muster,
gunpoint,
John was forced
man.
to sign the Magna Carta by his barons. President Lincoln's
I didn't know that. So was that for my English friends? Was that kind of part of it too? It was trying to make England's trying to make England's history more noble that way? That, you know, through a good there's this history of having like a good conscience and doing the right thing for the right reasons. Is that why you think that it perpetuated for so long? My English friends, let me know. All right, Lincoln's Little Woman? What?
In 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe published the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which became incredibly popular. The novel was a harsh depiction of life for African Americans.
Help for abolition.
It helped turn public
Abolition.
opinion in favor of abolition. It was also controversial, with slave owners and fans of slavery in general claiming that it was an inaccurate representation and was just abolitionist propaganda. When the Civil War broke out, Stowe traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet with President Lincoln. He greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that made this great war." It's a commonly referenced quote, but there is no evidence that it was ever said. Though the quote gained public attention after
Wait. I haven't heard that. Okay, was Lincoln pissed? Is that what it was? He's like, this is your fault, Miss Stowe, that I have to deal with this crap? Or was he like, thank you?
Is Stowe family law, there is no evidence that
He wouldn't have
Lincoln
said
ever made
thank
this
you.
specific
He
remark.
wouldn't. There's no way he would have been happy about it, especially not knowing what we know about what Lincoln really thought of slavery and all that kind of stuff.
Harriet made no reference to the quote herself. That said, it's not entirely impossible either. Though most historians believe the statement by Lincoln was entirely apocryphal, there was one thing that Stowe and her daughter Hattie, who traveled with her to the White House, were very clear on. Lincoln was an absolute riot. Stowe wrote to her husband, "I had a really funny interview with the president."
I heard he was
said,
pretty good.
"I will only say now that it was all very funny, and we were ready to explode with laughter all the while. I am a jelly donut."
Okay, whatever with him.
On June the 26th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy stood in West Berlin in front of the Berlin Wall to give one of the most memorable speeches of the Cold War. He spoke of freedom and democracy, but unfortunately, he made a terrible mistake. JFK was known to struggle with foreign languages, and he ended his speech with the phrase,
Berliner.
"Ich bin ein Berliner."
Yeah, ich bin ein Berliner.
I am a jelly donut. The audience erupted with laughter over this gaffe, and German political cartoonists had a field day with the speech for weeks. JFK had meant to say that he was a citizen of Berlin.
Right, like I'm a Berliner.
Adding the article "ein" completely changed the meaning of the sentence. That's the story most people know today, but it originated in a 1983 spy novel, Berlin Game. It was a one-line remark from a fictional character who was an unreliable narrator, but 5 years later it got picked up as
I didn't know this quote got misconstrued at all. Because that was like a famous thing, like, I'm a Berliner, you know what I mean? I am too. United States basically propping up all of West Berlin for decades.
It's almost baffling that this myth has persisted for so long, as footage of the speech is readily available. Anyone can see for themselves that nobody laughed at the president, instead erupting in thunderous applause.
I loved him.
To start, what he said was in fact grammatically correct. It was written for JFK by his translator, a native German speaker, who even gave him a phonetic pronunciation guide so he wouldn't screw it up. Although a Berliner is a type of jelly donut, people in Berlin and the surrounding area had a different word for them anyway. But even if that wasn't the case, and the statement did have two possible meanings,
someone's just hating on JFK.
German people would have understood what he meant in context.
They were just hating on him.
Governor. Despite spending decades in Hollywood, Ronald Reagan was never really a leading man. Women thought he came across as too nice, so he was mainly a character actor relegated to the role of plucky sidekick. It was rare for Reagan to receive top billing in a movie, and half the time
I've never seen a Reagan movie. Are there good ones? Like, do you guys have recommendations? I know there's big time Reagan fans. I see all around the Discord and stuff like that.
It was only because his co-star was a literal chimpanzee. This was perfectly articulated by Jack Warner of Warner Brothers. When Warner found out that Reagan was running for governor of California, it stated that his immediate reply was, "No, Jimmy Carter for governor, Ronald Reagan for governor's best friend." Despite being reported in Time magazine, it's unclear whether Warner actually made this statement or not. Reagan was known for his sense of humor, so it's quite possible that he made the story up as a joke. Walt Disney was frozen.
Who cares?
Aside from being
wait, he
an
wasn't?
incredibly adept businessman, Walt Disney was a fan of science fiction and futurism. Though it's now little more than a miniature
Forgot
World's
about
Fair,
that.
thanks to Walt's brother Roy, the Epcot Center originally stood for Experimental Prototype Community of Tomorrow. It was meant to be a glimpse into the future.
I didn't know
Disney
Epcot stood
was
for
often
that
on the
either.
cutting edge of technology within the film industry. It only made sense that such a forward-thinking individual would have his body cryogenically frozen upon his
He's
death,
not frozen?
a theoretical technology that was entering the public consciousness for the first time right around the time Disney died in 1966.
The only people I've heard of being frozen was him and Ted Williams, the baseball players. Ted Williams, was he actually frozen?
The following year, reports came out that this had happened, and everybody just kind of went with it. Not only did it seem to make sense as something Disney would do, but there had been no large funeral. Even back in the 60s, it was common for celebrities to have massive public funerals, so perhaps Disney didn't have one because there was no body to display. And it's true that there wasn't a body to display, but that's because Disney was cremated. He was a notoriously private person, so a large funeral would have been a strange decision. Instead,
Where'd that come from?
A small ceremony was held where his family interred his ashes in the family mausoleum. So how did the story start?
Yeah.
It seems to have first appeared in a tabloid the year following Disney's death. A writer claimed to have broken into a hospital by posing as an orderly and seen Disney's frozen body with his own eyes. The story got picked up and repeated, first by other tabloids, then by actual respectable news outlets, and it spread simply because people found it believable. Julius Caesar was born by
Caesarean section. Oh, I've heard of that, but I never put any stake into it. And also the Caesar dressing also has nothing to do with Julius Caesar. It's just the chef that made it. Is his name.
It's long been stated that Julius Caesar was born by Caesarean section. It is
creepy. What is that painting? Oh, thank God for the Renaissance and like good art finally coming out. It's like art was so bad for so long. Like they finally are like figuring out perspective and making people look like people. All right. I know the Renaissance is like super overrated, but I think we can appreciate that. Look at that demon coming out of this woman. That is not a human.
Usually said that the C-section was named after Caesar, though some accounts state that he was instead named after the procedure. He is often reported as being the first person born through this method, claiming it as the reason it was named after him. However, none of this is actually true. Regardless of what they were called, C-sections had been around for quite some time by the time of Caesar's reign and were not an invention.
Yeah, you'd think that'd be an old ancient practice.
Comes from Lex Caesare,
right? Like baby is in the wrong position or something like that and could suffocate. It's like, all right, do something else.
Was the law governing C-sections. Under the law, it was mandatory that any pregnant woman who died or was dying had to be cut open so the baby could be removed. But while this procedure had already existed for some time, it was nothing like how it exists in modern medicine. Once a woman was cut open, there was no sewing her back up. That's why it was only performed on those who were already dead or dying. Though this rumor about Caesar dates back to at least the 10th century, we do know.
Look at that. It's just like some hole, and all the babies in like medieval art always look just like fully they look like they're just straight up adults, and they always will mimic, they're not always, but like they'll mimic the exact facial expressions, like almost like it's copy and pasted with other characters. Like, look at this, you got this like midwife or whatever pulling out this, like, it doesn't look like a baby at all, right? And they have the same exact face.
That it can't be true.
Medieval art's whack.
Caesar's mother, Aurelia, survived his birth. Alice Cooper's kittens. Alice Cooper was in the business of shocking his fans at concerts, so much so that he's often referred to as the godfather of shock.
Was that what it was?
However, one stunt he performed on stage went too far for most people's sensibilities, though apparently not too far for the audience that night. At the start of one show, Cooper took to the stage carrying a bag of kittens with him. He then declared over the microphone, "I refuse to play until all these kittens are dead," before tossing the bag into the audience. Cooper's fans did as
heavy metal people, dude, they actually love animals, all right? They would not have been down with that.
Their idol had instructed them to do, and the show went on from there. Chances are you find this story to be impossibly absurd, and you'd be correct. However, many outraged parents believed otherwise, and this apocryphal tale is
they already hated rock,
Cooper's
heavy metal,
believed by those that seek to vilify music that they find inappropriate. Of course, this wasn't the first time that a story like this had appeared. Before Alice Cooper, a similar story circulated involving Ozzy Osbourne. Years later, an AOL chain letter warned of Marilyn Manson pulling an identical stunt with puppies. These fake reports of grotesque acts were a common way for people to garner support in vilifying anyone
biting the
whose
heads
music
of bats
they had some sort of moral opposition to. Decades later, Cooper was asked about
there were so many weird things like that. I remember about Marilyn Manson, because he was popular when I was growing up, of all this like weird sick things and stuff about his background, and none of it ended up being true. It was just, like he's saying, perpetuated by parents and stuff like that or whatever, because they're already predisposed to the belief about the awful nature of these people because of the type of music that they did.
During an interview, he laughed.
I feel like Manson was my version
but he was probably the one who started
Ozzy Osbourne, Alice Cooper.
The Great Fire. Over the course of 3 days, in October 1870,
Chicago Fire?
The Great Chicago Fire raged across the city. It destroyed 17,000 buildings, left over 100,000 residents,
I don't know,
and claimed the lives of 300 people. And how did this terrible fire begin? Well, that would be Mrs. O'Leary's cow. The fire was believed to have begun at around 8:30 p.m. on October the 8th, in or near the O'Leary's barn on DeCoven Street, as the shed next to their barn was the first building destroyed in the fire. The most popular explanation is that Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicked over the lantern, and that started the blaze that would engulf the city. There's absolutely no evidence to support this theory, but there was no evidence to support any other theory either. The Midwest was in the middle of an intense and
can't disprove
drought.
it.
Strong winds from the southeast would have easily helped a fire spread, and there were widespread fires across the entire region at the time.
Fires happen. Infrastructure for fighting fires was very bad. It's actually surprising stuff like this didn't happen more. It used to happen in Rome. Rome, was it Pompey that owned basically a fire fighting company, pretty much, that would do that? They would, because think about how easy fires, would be in a place like Rome. Everything's very close together, tons of wood, obviously don't have a lot of that water infrastructure. And I think that was how he made a lot of money. Something to be burning, and he would show up and be like, "Hey, give me a fortune and we'll put out this fire for it." And you're like, "Just do whatever. I'm going to lose everything." And then he, exploited people for that. But yeah, you think big fires like this would almost happen more, huh?
the city, even the smallest spark could have caused the fire. Since anything or anyone could have been at fault and there was no evidence or reason to suspect an intentional act of arson, people likely just decided it was better to blame Mrs. O'Leary's cow rather than to start a witch hunt. Bra burning. The United States
Hey, it's better than going and just like finding some like racial majority and just like, okay, let's just get rid of all them. You know what I mean? Like Nero blaming Christians or something. Yeah, it's better to, I guess, blame the cow than just some marginalized group. Okay, what about JFK?
Blame Mrs. O'Leary's cow rather than to start a witch hunt. Bra burning. The United States saw a large
feminist movement
in the 1960s and 70s. One of the most iconic and evocative images of this movement were bras being burned. Women were invited to remove their bras, seen as a symbol of male oppression, and cast them into a roaring bonfire. That's how people seem to remember it anyway, and it certainly does paint a rather vivid picture. In fact,
just kind of thought, okay,
such a vivid picture
could have existed.
People never stop to realize that the only images that exist of these bra burnings are the mental images that they conjure in their imaginations, because it never happened. At least, it mostly never happened. The protest that is cited as sparking this movement took place outside the Miss America pageant in 1968. There was a metal trash can, labeled as the Freedom Trash Can, and women were invited to throw things like mops, lipstick, and high heels inside. Some threw bras as well, but they were bras they had brought with them separately. A single passerby saw the protest and carefully removed her bra under her shirt, tossing it into the Freedom Trash Can. This single act made national
Freedom Trash. I love that idea.
The entire feminist movement. However,
what are you guys throwing in the 2024 Freedom Trash Can? What's going in there? Let me know.
Being thrown in the metal bin was actually lit on fire. There were many similar protests around the nation following this, and amongst all these protests, there is a single report of bras being burnt, despite it being remembered as the defining characteristic of the movement. The War of the Stray Dog. The incident at Petrich was a small military incursion between Greece and Bulgaria in October 1925. Tensions have been escalating between the two nations throughout the beginning of the 20th century due to disputes over Macedonia.
I don't know this dog story.
Thrace. They had engaged in open conflict multiple times, with Greece emerging victorious, but this was supposed to be a time of peace. Unfortunately, a Greek soldier's dog got away from him, crossing the border into Bulgaria. He chased after the dog, and Bulgarian border sentries opened fire on the Greek soldier, killing him. This resulted in a 10-day conflict with Greece invading Bulgaria and killing 50 people, mostly civilians, before the League of Nations intervened and made them put an end to the fighting. The story of the conflict's origin is why it is sometimes referred to as the War of the Stray Dog. An alternate story suggests that Bulgarian forces crossed the border and attacked a Greek outpost. Since neither side was going to be eager to claim fault for the fighting breaking out, we will likely never know whether or not the war was really started by a dog. Hugo Boss designed the Nazi uniforms. Born in 1885, Hugo Boss was a German
I have no idea this either. There was the uniforms? Like what part of the uniform? Not the swastika, but like...
who founded the luxury fashion house Hugo
Tell me what I'm
Boss
thinking
AG.
about.
He was also a supporter of the Nazi Party, having joined in 1931 before Hitler even came to power. As such, there is a persistent rumor in modern times that Hugo Boss designed the Nazis' uniforms. While this isn't accurate, it is a simple misunderstanding.
They had sharp-looking uniforms.
You can't. Fabrication. The iconic Schutzstaffel uniform was manufactured by...
They were well dressed.
It was designed by
graphic
designer Walter Heck, who was unaffiliated with Boss's company. Boss was manufacturing Nazi uniforms even before joining the Nazi Party, but afterwards he became a big supplier, manufacturing uniforms for both the SS and the Hitler Youth. Not only did Boss benefit by obtaining these manufacturing contracts, he was also given access to slave labor along the way, providing further financial benefits. So, while Hugo Boss was an active supporter of the Nazi Party who manufactured uniforms for them, he didn't actually design them. If the luxury fashion designer had been responsible for designing the SS's uniforms, their hats probably wouldn't have been decorated with a skull and crossbones.
Final thoughts. All right, if you stuck with me throughout this whole thing, thank you very much. Hopefully there's a lot of things that you can be kind of responding to in the comment section about some of these things there. And again, the title of the video was Greatest Historical Events That Never Happened. And really it's more just like 50 historical events that we can't confirm happened. That's really what a lot of it is. I mean, a few of them, I guess had something you could just counter the existence. Most of it's just like, there wasn't enough evidence. So anyways, do you think any of those things, the way that they're told dramatically changes our perception of whatever that topic is, or is it very minor? So which one of these things do you think the misconception could actually be very, I guess, harmful in the way that it's perpetuated through history? All right. With that, thank you all again for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time. Bye.